What would you do if a stranger offered to change your entire life with one question? Today's story is about Margaret, a single mother of two, who thought she was just applying for a housekeeper position in the wealthy Preston Hills district. Little did she know that by the end of that interview, she'd received the most unexpected proposal of her life, one that wasn't about love, but about something far more complicated. If you enjoy stories about second chances and unexpected connections, feel free to subscribe. It really helps the channel. And hey, tap the like button if you're curious to see how this unfolds. By the way, let me know in the comments. Where are you listening from? Margaret Sullivan clutched her worn leather purse tighter as she stepped into the gleaming elevator of the Preston Industries building in downtown Millbrook Valley. Her modest navy dress, carefully pressed that morning, felt suddenly shabby against the polished marble and gold fixtures surrounding her. The 34th floor seemed impossibly high for someone who had spent most of her life in ground-floor apartments and single-story houses. When the elevator doors opened with a soft chime, she found herself facing a reception area that looked more like a luxury hotel lobby than an office. The blonde receptionist, perfectly polished in her designer suit, looked up with practiced professionalism. "Mrs. Sullivan? Mr. Preston is ready to see you now." Margaret's heels clicked nervously on the marble floor as she followed the receptionist down a hallway lined with oil paintings and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the valley below. 3 months of unemployment since the textile mill closed had brought her to this moment. Applying for a housekeeper position at the estate of Daniel Preston, the CEO whose name appeared on half the buildings in town. Through the glass walls of his corner office, she could see him reviewing papers at an enormous mahogany desk, his dark hair perfectly styled, his expensive suit fitting him like it was crafted specifically for his tall frame. When he looked up, his sharp green eyes studied her with an intensity that made her stomach flutter with nervousness. "Please sit down, Mrs. Sullivan," Daniel said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of making decisions that affected hundreds of people. Margaret perched on the edge of the leather chair across from his desk, acutely aware of how small she felt in the vast office. Behind him, she noticed family photographs, a beautiful brunette woman in an elegant wedding dress, the same woman holding his hand at various social events, but no children visible in any of the pictures. "I've reviewed your application," he continued, opening a manila folder. "You worked at Henderson Textiles for 8 years before they closed. You have 2 children, Tommy, age 8, and Sarah, age 5. You've been unemployed for 3 months. His recitation of the facts of her life felt clinical, almost cold, but she detected something else in his voice, perhaps understanding of what those bare facts really meant. "Yes, sir," Margaret replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm a hard worker, Mr. Preston. I know the housekeeper position requires long hours, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying her with those piercing eyes. For a long moment, the only sound in the office was the distant hum of traffic 34 floors below. Then he closed the file with a decisive snap. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm not offering you the housekeeper job. I have something else in mind entirely." Margaret's heart sank. She had pinned all her hopes on this position, had even borrowed money for bus fare to get here. I don't understand," she stammered, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. Daniel stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he looked out over the valley that bore his family's name. "What I'm about to propose will sound unusual, perhaps even shocking," he began, his voice measured and careful. But I assure you, it's a legitimate business arrangement that could benefit both of us considerably." He turned back to face her, and Margaret saw something vulnerable flicker across his features before the professional mask returned. "I need a wife, Mrs. Sullivan. Not for love, not for companionship, but for appearances. My board of directors has become concerned about my personal stability. They believe a married man with a family presents a more trustworthy image for our upcoming merger." Margaret stared at him in complete shock, certain she had misunderstood. "A wife?" she repeated weakly. "You're suggesting that I—" "Marry me, yes," Daniel said matter-of-factly, returning to his seat. "It would be a business arrangement, nothing more. You and your children would live in my home, want for nothing, and have access to the best schools and health care. In return, you would accompany me to social functions and present the image of a stable family man that my board requires." The room seemed to spin around Margaret as she tried to process what she was hearing. "But we don't even know each other," she whispered. "Exactly," Daniel replied, "which makes it clean, uncomplicated. No messy emotions, no unrealistic expectations. Simply a mutually beneficial arrangement." He slid a business card across the polished desk toward her. "You have 48 hours to decide, Mrs. Sullivan. But I should warn you, my late wife's family believes no one will ever be worthy of replacing her." Margaret sat at her small kitchen table in the tiny apartment above Murphy's hardware store, staring at the business card Daniel Preston had given her. The gold lettering seemed to mock her from across the scratched wooden surface. Tommy was sprawled on the threadbare carpet, working on his homework with a stubby pencil, while 5-year-old Sarah played with her one remaining doll, the one whose hair she had cut herself last month in an attempt to make it look pretty like Mommy. The afternoon sun streaming through their single window highlighted the peeling paint on the walls and the growing stack of unpaid bills on the counter. Margaret had counted their remaining money 3 times that morning. After rent, they had enough for maybe 2 weeks of groceries, and that was if she bought only the absolute necessities. Tommy's shoes had holes in the soles, and Sarah needed winter clothes that Margaret couldn't afford. The heating bill remained unopened because she already knew what it would say. "Mommy, you look sad," Sarah said, abandoning her doll to climb onto Margaret's lap. Her small arms wrapped around her mother's neck with the trusting affection that made Margaret's heart ache with both love and guilt. How could she explain to a 5-year-old that their world was falling apart? "I'm just thinking, sweetheart," Margaret murmured, smoothing Sarah's fine blonde hair. "About what?" Tommy asked, looking up from his homework with the serious expression that made him seem older than his 8 years. He had been forced to grow up too quickly since his father died, taking on responsibilities that no child should have to bear. Margaret had seen him counting coins from his piggy bank, heard him telling Sarah they couldn't afford treats at the store. "Well," Margaret began carefully, "I met a man today who offered us a chance to live somewhere new. A big house with lots of rooms and a yard for you to play in." Sarah's eyes lit up immediately. "A real house? With a backyard? Could I have a swing?" The innocent hope in her daughter's voice made Margaret's chest tighten. "Maybe, honey. But it would mean some big changes for our family." Tommy set down his pencil and studied his mother's face with the intensity of someone who had learned to read between the lines. "What kind of changes?" "The man I met, his name is Mr. Preston. He's very successful, very wealthy. He asked if we might want to live with him." Margaret chose her words carefully, unwilling to burden her children with the full complexity of the situation. Like he wants to be our new daddy? Sarah asked with the straightforward curiosity of a child. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Something like that, yes. Tommy's frown deepened. But you don't love him. It wasn't a question. Her son had inherited his father's ability to see straight to the heart of matters. No, I don't, Margaret admitted. But sometimes adults make decisions based on what's best for their families, not just what they want for themselves. Tommy stood up, his thin frame somehow conveying a dignity that made Margaret proud and heartbroken at the same time. Mom, are you going to marry someone you don't love just so we can have food? The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Margaret felt the weight of every choice she had never wanted to make pressing down on her shoulders. Before she could answer, a knock at the door interrupted them. Margaret opened it to find Mrs. Chen from the apartment downstairs, holding an envelope. "This came for you, dear," the elderly woman said, but her eyes were kind with understanding. Margaret recognized the letterhead immediately, the electric company's final notice. 2 days later, Margaret stood in the marble foyer of Daniel Preston's estate on Willowbrook Road, feeling like Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole. The house was even more magnificent than she had imagined, with soaring ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and artwork that probably cost more than she had earned in her entire life. Tommy and Sarah pressed close to her sides, their eyes wide with wonder and uncertainty. Sarah whispered, "Is this really going to be our house, Mommy?" before Margaret could shush her. "Welcome to Willowbrook Manor," Daniel said, appearing from a side room. He wore casual clothes today, khaki pants and a navy sweater, but somehow still managed to look like he belonged on the cover of a magazine. He had been polite but distant during their brief wedding ceremony at the courthouse that morning, treating it exactly like the business transaction he had described. The children's rooms are in the east wing, connected to the master suite by a sitting room. I thought you would prefer to have them close. Before Margaret could respond, the massive front door opened without warning, and a woman in her 60s swept in like a force of nature. She wore a perfectly tailored beige suit and pearls, her silver hair styled in an elegant chignon. Everything about her screamed old money and social prominence. Her sharp blue eyes took in Margaret and the children with obvious disapproval. "Daniel," she said coolly, "I see you've already moved your new family into Victoria's home." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Eleanor, I wasn't expecting you." "Margaret, children, this is Mrs. Eleanor Preston-Whitmore, my late wife's mother." Eleanor's smile was as warm as winter frost. "How charming. And these must be the children I've heard about." Her gaze swept over Tommy and Sarah like they were specimens in a laboratory. "I do hope they understand the importance of treating this house with the respect it deserves. Victoria decorated every room herself, you know. Every piece has sentimental value." Margaret felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but before she could respond, Eleanor stepped closer and lowered her voice so only Margaret could hear. "I will make sure this town knows exactly what kind of woman accepts money to marry above her station." The next morning, Margaret walked Tommy and Sarah through the halls of Millbrook Valley Elementary School, acutely aware of how their new designer clothes made them stand out like peacocks among sparrows. She had found the outfits laid out in their rooms that morning, complete with matching shoes and backpacks, all bearing expensive brand names she recognized from magazine advertisements. Tommy tugged uncomfortably at his polo shirt, while Sarah kept smoothing her pleated skirt with nervous hands. "Remember what we talked about?" Margaret whispered as they approached Tommy's third-grade classroom. If anyone asks questions, just say we're living with Mr. Preston now. You don't have to explain anything else." But the whispers had already started. Margaret caught fragments of conversations as parents dropped off their children. "That's the woman who married Daniel Preston. Can you believe she brought those kids into Victoria's house? I heard she was just a mill worker before." The school secretary, a plump woman with kind eyes, tried to be welcoming, but even she seemed curious about the sudden change in the children's circumstances. "We'll take good care of them, Mrs. Preston," she said, emphasizing the new last name with obvious uncertainty. After leaving the children, Margaret drove Daniel's spare car, a luxury sedan that she was terrified of scratching, to the grocery store in the town center. She had never shopped anywhere fancier than the discount market near her old apartment, and the upscale Millbrook market felt like foreign territory. The produce section alone was larger than her entire former grocery store, with exotic fruits she couldn't identify and prices that made her dizzy. She was studying a display of organic vegetables when she heard familiar voices from the next aisle. "I still can't believe Daniel went through with it," said a woman with a sharp, nasal tone. "Poor Victoria must be spinning in her grave." "Eleanor is beside herself," replied another voice. "She told me at Bridge Club that the woman is nothing but a gold digger who saw an opportunity and took it. 2 children from a previous marriage, if you can imagine. Daniel's always been too trusting for his own good." Margaret froze, her hand halfway to a bunch of carrots. She recognized one of the voices, Mrs. Henderson, whose husband had owned the textile mill where she used to work. "The children are in school with my grandson," Mrs. Henderson continued. "He said the boy got into a fight on his very first day, defending his mother's honor or some such nonsense. These people don't understand how to behave in polite society." Margaret's cheeks burned with humiliation as she realized they were talking about Tommy. Her gentle, thoughtful son had been driven to violence because of gossip about her. She abandoned her shopping cart and fled to the parking lot, where she sat in Daniel's expensive car and cried until her mascara ran. Her phone rang just as she was trying to compose herself. The caller ID showed Millbrook Valley Elementary School, and her heart immediately sank to her stomach. "Mrs. Preston?" came the voice of Principal Anderson. "This is about Tommy. There's been an incident, and we need you here immediately." Margaret drove back to the school with her hands shaking on the steering wheel. She found Tommy sitting in the principal's office with a bloody lip and torn shirt, while another boy, clearly from one of the wealthy families, judging by his pristine uniform and confident posture, sat across from him with his perfectly styled mother hovering protectively nearby. "Mrs. Preston," Principal Anderson began diplomatically, "it seems there was a disagreement during recess." The other mother, a blonde woman in a tennis outfit that probably cost more than Margaret's wedding dress, spoke up immediately. "Your son attacked my Bradley for no reason whatsoever. This is exactly the kind of behavior we were afraid of when we heard about your situation." Margaret looked at Tommy, whose eyes were filled with tears of rage and hurt. "What happened, honey?" she asked gently. "He said you were a bad person who married Mr. Preston for his money," Tommy said, his voice shaking. "He said everyone knows you're just pretending to be married and that we don't belong here. I told him to take it back, but he kept saying mean things about you, so I pushed him." The principal cleared his throat uncomfortably. "While we understand that Tommy was defending his family, we can't tolerate physical violence. However, given the circumstances and the fact that this was his first day, we're willing to let both boys off with a warning." That evening, Daniel had arranged their first social gathering since the wedding, a dinner party for the board members and their wives. Margaret stood in front of her bedroom mirror, wearing the black cocktail dress Daniel had selected for her, feeling like she was putting on a costume for a play she didn't know how to perform. The dress fit perfectly, and the jewelry he had provided was stunning, but she felt like a fraud underneath it all. The dining room had been transformed into something from a magazine shoot, with crystal glasses and silver that reflected the light from the chandelier above. Margaret tried to remember everything she had hurriedly researched online about proper etiquette, but her hands still trembled as she reached for her water glass. Eleanor had positioned herself strategically at Margaret's left, making pointed comments throughout the meal about appropriate dinner conversation and the importance of understanding one's social responsibilities. When Margaret tried to contribute to a discussion about the local arts council, Eleanor smoothly redirected the conversation away from her, as if she hadn't spoken at all. "Daniel tells us you have 2 children," said Mrs. Mitchell, the wife of board member James Mitchell. Her tone was polite but cool, with an undercurrent of judgment that Margaret had learned to recognize. "How are they adjusting to their new school?" "Very well, thank you," Margaret replied, though the lie tasted bitter after the day's events. "Millbrook Elementary has an excellent reputation." "Oh, yes," Eleanor interjected with false sweetness, "though I understand there was already some excitement on their first day. Children can be so unpredictable when they're not used to certain standards of behavior." Margaret felt her face flush with embarrassment as several of the guests turned to look at her with renewed interest. She caught Daniel's eye across the table, but his expression remained neutral, professional. After dinner, as the guests moved to the living room for cocktails, board member James Mitchell approached Margaret near the bar. He was a man in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of predatory smile that made her skin crawl. "Enjoying your new life, Mrs. Preston?" he asked, standing closer than necessary. "It must be quite an adjustment from your previous circumstances." Margaret forced herself to meet his gaze. "I'm very grateful for the opportunities Daniel has given my children and me." Mitchell's smile widened, and she realized with growing unease that he was enjoying her discomfort. "We all know why Daniel married you, of course. The question is, what's your real game plan? How long before you decide this arrangement isn't quite lucrative enough?" 3 days after the disastrous dinner party, Margaret found herself alone in the house, while Daniel attended meetings and the children were at school. She had been looking for a book to read when she noticed that the door to Daniel's home office was slightly ajar. She had been explicitly told that his office was off limits, but something drew her toward the partially open door. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps it was the desperate need to understand the man she had married and the world she had entered so blindly. The office was a study in masculine elegance, with dark wood paneling and leather-bound books lining the walls. Daniel's desk was meticulously organized, with neat stacks of documents and a laptop computer that probably cost more than her old car. But it was the framed photographs scattered across a side table that caught her attention first. Unlike the formal portraits displayed throughout the rest of the house, these were candid shots. Daniel and Victoria laughing at some private joke. Daniel pushing Victoria on a swing in what looked like the estate's garden. Daniel holding Victoria's hand as she lay in what was obviously a hospital bed, her head wrapped in a colorful scarf that couldn't quite hide her illness. Margaret's heart ached as she looked at the obvious love and pain captured in those images. She was about to leave when she noticed a folder marked "Confidential Board Review" lying open on Daniel's desk. Her conscience told her to walk away, but her desperation to understand her situation overrode her better judgment. The financial documents inside painted a picture that was completely different from what she had imagined. Preston Industries wasn't the thriving empire she had assumed. The company was hemorrhaging money, losing major contracts, and facing what the documents described as imminent bankruptcy, without the merger that Daniel had mentioned. The board of directors had issued an ultimatum: present a stable, family-oriented image or face removal as CEO. The merger wasn't just about expansion, it was about survival, both for the company and for Daniel personally. A handwritten note in Daniel's precise script at the bottom of one page made her stomach clench. Personal assets may be insufficient to cover employee severance and benefits if merger fails. Must consider all options to protect 847 employees and their families. Beneath the financial papers, she found a stack of personal letters tied with a black ribbon. Her hands trembled as she recognized the return address: Millbrook Valley Hospital's Oncology Department. The letters were addressed to Daniel, dated over 2 years ago. Against her better judgment, she untied the ribbon and began to read. The first letter was from Victoria herself, written in a shaky hand that betrayed her illness. My darling Daniel, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you're trying to figure out how to live without me. Please don't shut yourself away from love. You have so much to give, and you deserve to be happy again. I know you think marrying me was the best thing that ever happened to you, but I think loving me taught you how to love. Don't waste that gift. Find someone who needs what you have to offer, and let them love you back. You were my everything, but you don't have to be alone forever. All my love, Victoria. The sound of the front door opening made Margaret drop the letters in panic. She quickly retied the ribbon and placed everything back where she had found it, but her hands were shaking so badly that she knocked over a pen holder. Pens scattered across the desk as footsteps approached the office. You weren't supposed to see those, Daniel said quietly from the doorway. His voice was devoid of anger, but Margaret could see pain etched across his features as he took in the scattered papers and her obvious guilt. She turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. Daniel, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to pry. I was just trying to understand why I would marry a stranger, he asked, stepping into the office and closing the door behind him. I suppose you have that right. Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I had no idea about the company's situation. You made it sound like this marriage was just about board politics, not about saving people's jobs. Daniel walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in the gesture she was beginning to recognize as his way of maintaining emotional distance. 847 families depend on Preston Industries for their livelihood. If the merger fails, I lose everything. But more importantly, so do they. Some of those people have worked for my family for 30 years. And Victoria? Margaret asked softly. How does she fit into all of this? For a long moment, Daniel didn't respond. When he finally turned back to face her, his professional mask had cracked, revealing the grief and loneliness he usually kept hidden. Victoria died 26 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days ago. Brain cancer. We had 6 months from diagnosis to the end. 6 months to say goodbye to 15 years of marriage. He sat heavily in the chair behind his desk, suddenly looking older than his 42 years. I haven't been able to move forward since then. Haven't been able to let anyone in. The board was right to be concerned about my stability. I've been running on autopilot for over 2 years. Margaret felt her heart break for this man who had shouldered so much pain and responsibility alone. She wrote that you deserve to be happy again. She also wrote that I should find someone who needs what I have to offer, Daniel replied, his green eyes meeting hers for the first time since entering the office. Someone who could let me help them, even if love wasn't part of the equation. When I read your application, when I saw that you were struggling to provide for your children, I thought maybe this could work for both of us. The vulnerability in his voice made Margaret take a step toward him. You're trying to save your employees by sacrificing your own chance at real happiness. And you're trying to save your children by sacrificing yours, he replied. Maybe that makes us both fools, or maybe it makes us parents who understand what matters most. The moment stretched between them, filled with a connection that neither had expected. For the first time since their wedding, they were seeing each other as real people with real pain and real hopes. The dinner parties, the social expectations, Margaret said slowly. You hate them as much as I do. More, probably, Daniel admitted with a rueful smile. Victoria always handled the social requirements of my position. Without her, I'm as lost at those events as you are. Just then, the sound of slow, sarcastic clapping came from behind them. They both spun around to see Eleanor standing in the office doorway, her expression a mixture of triumph and disgust. How touching, she said coldly, stepping into the room uninvited. The grieving widower and his convenient bride bonding over their mutual martyrdom. I wonder what the board would think of this little performance. The next afternoon, Eleanor had called an emergency meeting at the Preston Hills Country Club, a bastion of old money and older prejudices, where she held court like a queen among her subjects. Margaret had no idea such a meeting was taking place until she decided to drive to the club to meet Daniel for lunch, as they had arranged that morning. The maitre d' directed her toward the private dining room, but as she approached, she heard Eleanor's voice carrying through the partially open door. Something in the tone made her pause just outside, hidden behind a marble pillar. I'm telling you, this marriage is a farce that will destroy everything the Preston name represents, Eleanor was saying to what sounded like a room full of people. That woman has manipulated Daniel during the most vulnerable period of his life. She saw a grieving widower with money and children to be provided for, and she pounced. Margaret's heart began to race as she recognized other voices joining the conversation. James Mitchell, the board member who had cornered her at the dinner party, spoke up next. Eleanor raises valid concerns. The merger partners are already asking questions about Daniel's judgment. His sudden marriage to a woman from such different circumstances has raised eyebrows in New York. I've known Daniel since he was a boy, came another voice that Margaret recognized as belonging to Judge Harrison, one of the most respected men in the valley. His father would be appalled to see him throw away his reputation for a woman who clearly married him for financial gain. Eleanor's voice rose with theatrical emotion. Yesterday I found them in his office, going through Victoria's personal letters together. The woman was crying crocodile tears while Daniel comforted her. It was a performance worthy of Broadway, designed to make him feel guilty for not giving her more attention. Margaret pressed herself against the pillar, feeling sick to her stomach as she realized how Eleanor had twisted the intimate moment she and Daniel had shared. The children are disruptive influences as well, Eleanor continued. The boy has already been in fights at school, and the school administration is concerned about their adjustment issues. These people don't understand how to behave in civilized society. So what do you propose we do? Asked Mitchell. The marriage is legal, and Daniel seems committed to maintaining it, at least for now. We convince him that this arrangement is damaging not only to his personal reputation, but to the company's prospects, Eleanor replied smoothly. The merger partners need to see stability and appropriate family values, not some desperate arrangement with a gold digger and her problematic children. We present him with an ultimatum: annul this marriage or face removal as CEO. Margaret heard murmurs of agreement around the room, and her vision began to blur with tears and rage. These people were discussing her family's future as if they were planning a dinner menu, reducing her children to problems and her marriage to a calculated scheme. She was about to flee when she heard Daniel's voice from inside the room. "I appreciate all of your concerns," he said, and Margaret's heart sank as she realized he had been there the entire time, listening to them tear her apart. "Daniel, thank goodness you're here," Eleanor said with false relief. "We've been discussing the situation, and we all agree that immediate action is necessary." "And what action would that be?" Daniel asked, his tone carefully neutral. Margaret couldn't see his face, but she could imagine his professional mask firmly in place. Mitchell cleared his throat. "We think it would be best for everyone involved if you quietly dissolved this marriage. Claim irreconcilable differences, provide a generous settlement for the woman and her children, and move forward with a more suitable arrangement. The merger partners have specifically mentioned their concerns about family stability," added Judge Harrison. "They need to see you with someone who fits their expectations of what a CEO's wife should be." Margaret couldn't bear to hear any more. She turned and fled through the club's elegant corridors, past oil paintings of long-dead patriarchs and marble busts of forgotten philanthropists, out into the parking lot where she collapsed against Daniel's car and sobbed. Her phone was ringing, but she ignored it. Everything Eleanor had said was true in its own twisted way. She had married Daniel for financial security. Her son had been in a fight, and she didn't belong in their world. Maybe the kindest thing she could do for Daniel and his company was to remove herself and her children from the equation. 20 minutes later, Margaret sat in her old empty apartment above Murphy's hardware store, staring at the familiar water stains on the ceiling and breathing in the scent of sawdust that seeped up from the store below. The apartment had been rented to someone else, but the new tenants wouldn't move in until the following week, so Margaret still had her old key. Tommy and Sarah sat on the floor beside her, confused and frightened by their mother's sudden decision to leave the beautiful house and return to this cramped, cold space. "Mommy, why can't we go back to the big house?" Sarah asked for the third time, her small voice echoing in the empty room. "Did we do something wrong?" Tommy remained silent, but Margaret could see the understanding in his eyes. Her perceptive son had already figured out that this wasn't a temporary visit. Margaret pulled both children close, her heart breaking as she tried to find words to explain a situation that made no sense even to her. "Sometimes adults make mistakes," she began carefully, "and sometimes those mistakes affect other people in ways we didn't expect." "You mean marrying Mr. Preston was a mistake?" Tommy asked quietly. Before Margaret could answer, she heard footsteps on the stairs outside the apartment door. Heavy, determined footsteps that could only belong to one person. The door opened without a knock, and Daniel appeared in the doorway, his expensive suit looking completely out of place in the shabby surroundings. His face was haggard, his usually perfect hair disheveled as if he had been running his hands through it. "Margaret," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You left." "I heard them, Daniel," Margaret replied without turning around to face him. "I heard everything they said at the club, and they're right. This marriage was a mistake, and I'll be filing for divorce immediately." Daniel stepped into the room, and she could feel his presence behind her like a physical weight. "The board voted," he said, his voice breaking in a way she had never heard before. "They're removing me as CEO unless I can prove this marriage is real." That night, Margaret lay awake on the thin mattress she had borrowed from Mrs. Chen, staring at the ceiling and listening to her children's restless sleep. Every few minutes, Sarah would whimper and reach out in her dreams, searching for the comfort and security they had briefly known. Tommy had been silent since Daniel left, his 8-year-old mind trying to process the adult complexities that had once again turned his world upside down. By dawn, Margaret had made her decision. She woke the children gently and dressed them in the simple clothes they had worn during their old life, leaving the expensive outfits Daniel had bought them folded neatly in the corner. "Where are we going, Mommy?" Sarah asked sleepily, as Margaret helped her into her worn sneakers. "We're going to help someone who needs us," Margaret replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do." An hour later, Margaret burst through the doors of the Preston Industries boardroom with Tommy and Sarah close behind her, and Daniel bringing up the rear with a mixture of pride and terror on his face. The emergency board meeting was already in session, with Eleanor presiding over the gathering like a judge at a trial. James Mitchell was in the middle of presenting what looked like legal documents when Margaret's dramatic entrance brought all conversation to an immediate halt. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Margaret announced, her voice carrying clearly through the room despite her racing heartbeat. "But I believe you're discussing my family, and I think we deserve to be heard." Eleanor's face went white with shock, then red with fury. "This is a private board meeting. You have no right to be here." "I have every right," Margaret replied, walking to the front of the room with her children flanked by Daniel. "You've been making decisions about our lives without bothering to learn who we actually are." She turned to face the assembled board members, men and women in expensive suits who held Daniel's future in their hands. "My name is Margaret Sullivan Preston, and these are my children, Tommy and Sarah. 3 months ago, we were living in a one-room apartment, and I was facing the possibility of losing my children because I couldn't provide for them. When Daniel offered me marriage, yes, it was for practical reasons. But what happened after that? What's happening now? That's real." Tommy stepped forward, his young voice clear and strong. "Mr. Preston reads to us every night," he said, looking directly at Eleanor. "And he helped me with my math homework when I was struggling. He doesn't just give us things, he listens to us." Sarah, emboldened by her brother's courage, added in her small voice, "He teaches me about the flowers in the garden, and he always remembers to cut the crusts off my sandwiches the way I like them." Margaret felt tears stinging her eyes as she listened to her children defend the man who had become so much more than just a provider. "You want to know what kind of marriage this is?" she asked the room. "It's the kind where a man works 16-hour days to save 800 jobs while still finding time to attend school plays and help with homework. It's the kind where a woman learns to host dinner parties and smile at people who whisper about her behind her back because she believes in the man she married." Eleanor stood up abruptly, her composure finally cracking. "This is all very touching, but the fact remains that this woman married Daniel for money. I have proof. Bank records showing suspicious transfers from household accounts. She's been stealing from him while playing the devoted wife." The room erupted in shocked murmurs, and Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. She had forgotten about the monthly transfers she had been making, and now Eleanor was twisting them into evidence of theft. But Daniel stepped forward, carrying a manila folder that Margaret hadn't noticed before. Yes, there have been transfers from our household accounts, he said calmly. I authorized every one of them after I discovered what my wife was doing with the money. He opened the folder and pulled out a stack of receipts and medical bills. Margaret has been using her household allowance to pay for prescription medications and medical treatments for elderly residents at Sunset Manor Nursing Home, including Mrs. Preston-Whitmore, your own sister Dorothy, whom you haven't visited or supported financially in over 2 years. The silence in the room was deafening. Eleanor's face went completely white as she stared at the documents Daniel held up for everyone to see. Margaret found out about Dorothy's situation when she volunteered at the nursing home last month, Daniel continued. Your sister has been struggling to afford her heart medication, so my wife has been quietly covering the costs. She's also been paying for physical therapy for 3 other residents whose families abandoned them. Margaret watched as Eleanor's carefully constructed image crumbled before the board's eyes. Several members were looking at Eleanor with obvious disgust, while others studied the medical bills with growing respect for Margaret's actions. Judge Harrison cleared his throat and looked directly at Eleanor. You accused this woman of being a gold digger, but it seems she's been giving away gold instead of digging for it. James Mitchell, the board member who had been so suspicious of Margaret, stood up slowly. Mrs. Preston, I owe you an apology. We all do. But Eleanor wasn't finished. Her humiliation had transformed into desperate rage, and she played her final card with the viciousness of someone who had nothing left to lose. This doesn't change anything, she shouted, her voice shaking with fury. I don't care what charitable work she's done. This marriage is still a sham, and I have documentation proving that Margaret Sullivan has been embezzling funds through forged authorizations. She reached into her purse and pulled out what appeared to be official bank documents, waving them triumphantly. These transfers were made without Daniel's knowledge or consent. This woman is a criminal who has manipulated my son-in-law's grief for her own gain. The room fell silent again, as Eleanor's accusation hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. Margaret felt her knees go weak as she realized that Eleanor had somehow manufactured evidence against her. Even if the allegations were false, the mere suggestion of financial impropriety could destroy everything Daniel had worked for. But then Daniel did something that surprised everyone in the room, including Margaret. He began to laugh, not the bitter laugh of a defeated man, but the genuine laughter of someone who had just realized something wonderful. Eleanor, he said, still chuckling, you've just proved beyond any doubt that this marriage is completely real. The confusion in the room was palpable as Daniel walked over to Margaret and took her hand. A real wife would have access to joint accounts and the authority to make financial decisions for the family. The fact that you had to forge documents to make it look like Margaret was acting without authorization proves that she actually does have that authorization, because we're actually married, and she's actually my partner in every sense of the word. Eleanor's forged documents fluttered to the floor as the full implications of Daniel's words sank in. The board members began to murmur among themselves, and Margaret could see approval and even admiration replacing the suspicion in their faces. Judge Harrison spoke for the group when he said, "Motion to retain Daniel Preston as CEO with full board confidence? All in favor?" The vote was unanimous, with Eleanor abstaining in stunned silence.